Hi there, welcome to my new YouTube channel. This is video 1, Trapped in the Care System, 18 years, my story. This is the diary of my whole childhood. It is connected in an indirect way with the Anna Wilson home, but this is basically included with the diary of the Anna Wilson home, but this is pretty much the whole story from when I was 3 weeks old right the way through to when I was 18 years of age. So here we go. This is also written from, read from a script, so sorry if I do hesitate on words. It's just I'm trying to understand my my handwriting as well at the same time. Beginning of YouTube introduction. This is the diary of my life in the care system and how I did not have a voice on where and when I lived throughout my childhood until the age of 18 years old. My story of being trapped in the care system for 18 years, give or take a few weeks within my whole childhood in the hands of my local care authority. The troubles of my mother, my father, my grandmother and grandfather on both sides, social services and the courts. This YouTube blog is to make people aware of the system in the 1970s and 80s, which was when I was trapped in the system for legal reasons. I am not able to talk about people's names, especially surnames, or places, e.g. children's homes, where I lived, if they still exist to this day. I was not going to start doing this YouTube blog until I felt ready to do it, but I have already done another YouTube blog, like I said before, the Anna Wilson Children's Home, which was about abuse at children's home. The children's home was called the Anna Wilson Children's Home at 47 Marine Parade, Tankerton, Kent, but the home does not exist anymore. Like and share this page. Anyway, this is the beginning of my story. Pretty much I've got A4 size pieces of paper and I've got 23 sides. So I'm going to do this in several different videos, and here we go. My name is Phil and I am 47 and a half years old. Now, at the time of me writing this, I was 46. It was a year and a half ago since I wrote this. And this is my story. It all started in Covent Garden, London, in 1968, where my mother and father first met while working at the Lloyds Bank, Covent Garden branch. My dad was a bank clerk and my mother worked in foreign currency exchange. My father kept on pestering my mother to go on a date until she finally conceded, and it all started from there. After dating each other for some time, my father met my grandmother and my grandfather, not to realise that they would become my father's in-laws. At this time, my grandfather lived in Hampstead and my grandmother lived in Swiss Cottage. My mother at this time was living with her mother at Daylham Gardens, Swiss Cottage, and this is where my father would meet up with her. Apparently I was conceived at Daylham Gardens, Swiss Cottage in 1971. This is where my personal story starts. My mum was rushed into hospital after contractions started, but I did not want to come out straight away. While my mother was in hospital with an expectant baby, otherwise me, my mother had support of my father, who mainly stayed during the day to the early evenings while she was in hospital. My grandmother stayed overnight and my grandfather would do a mix of days and nights. My mother would constantly point out to me, even to this very day, that my father would only see my mother until the early evening so he could get his beauty sleep. Now, my grandfather would do a mix of days and nights. My mother would constantly point out that my grandfather was there and she was the first person to see her when she woke up. As I said later on in life, that my father had to go home early in the evening as he had to go back home for his beauty sleep. So my father never stayed at the hospital overnight. After complications with my mother's birth of me, I was finally born at 9 a.m. Tuesday, 28th of March 1972. I was born in WA, Kensington, Princess Beatrice Hospital on the Old Brompton Road, and this hospital still stands to this day and has been converted into flats originally for low-income families. The birth had complications and was a neonatal forceps delivery. With my weight of 6 pounds, I was a bit of a featherweight when it came to that, with black hair and hazel eyes. When my mother woke up after the birth, my mother saw my grandfather at the end of the hospital bed, writing a letter after the best sleep she had ever had. It was a further 10 days until my mother and I had left the hospital after my mother given birth to me before moving into Merston Sittingbourne, which was the family home. At this time, it was a new build and my dad wanted to buy a house which no one else had lived in. Later on in life, I realised why my father wanted to buy a new build was because he absolutely resented any kind of DIY, as he never did any in the house, even up till when he sold the house. This is page 2 now. 10 days after being born, moved into the new home at Oak Road, Merston, Sittingbourne, Kent. Unfortunately, 2 weeks later, my mum was rushed back into hospital at Clapham near Canterbury because of an abscess on my mother's breast, and she also had a mental breakdown / nervous breakdown. To this day, I wonder if this was postnatal depression. With mum having a breakdown, she was subjected to barbarism of ECT, which stands for electroconvulsive therapy, which is like electrocuting the brain to control the thought patterns in the brain. Mum was in hospital for 6 weeks during her recovery. At that time, Dad had a full-time job and thought it would be best to get in touch with social services to intervene. Signed and dusted, I was put into a temporary care order, so this meant that Kent Social Services needed to find me a temporary foster parent, whilst my mum was in a psychiatric ward to have ECT treatment. Ironically, later on in life, mum became good friends with a lovely chap whose great uncle invented ECT and the antidepressant drug, which are prescribed to this very day for mental health patients. On these drugs, or ECT, apparently you were not allowed broad beans, yogurt, cheese or alcohol, which mum remembers to this very day. This meant that on the 14th of April, I was put into care of foster parents by Kent County Council. My social worker at the time, which I cannot name her name, was my social worker and dealt with me with all my affairs of my placement into the foster parents. 6 weeks later, after being with foster parents in Faversham, I went back to Merston Sittingbourne with my mother and father. Then weeks later, I ended up going back into care, where my father signed a consent form for me to go into care if things did not work out at home. During this trial period and previously, I did see the rest of my family, who to this day I have photos of. My grandmother and grandfather on my mother's side, grandfather on my dad's side, a close friend of my mother and my grandmother, I cannot name any of these names, used to visit too. She was a close friend of my grandmother's. My godparents were good friends of my mother's, who are also godparents via my mother, but not on my father's side, have been in contact with me throughout my life and have stood by. My brother and sister also used to visit. Now, I cannot name their names, who were my dad's previous marriage, who are my half-brother and sister, as we had different mothers, but the same father. But as I say, they are from my dad's previous marriage, and they're not directly my brother and sister, but they are my half-brother and sister. It got to that time in my life where social services were trying to take control out of my family's hands. My godparents said they would look after me, but they came from South Africa. Even though they lived in the UK at the time, they were actually going back to South Africa. They were my godparents, but social services didn't want me to leave the country. Another chap also offered to look after me, who lived in Switzerland, who was the son of a good friend of my grandmother's, but he was declined because he lived out of the country too. Finally, my grandfather and my grandmother were declined because they were too old. I feel like my life, and that was on both sides of the family, my father's dad and his wife. I'm not sure if his wife was still around at the time of my birth, when I was born, but my grandparents on my mother's side both of them were, my grandmother, my grandfather, and my mother's side. I feel like my life had been taken away from me before I was even 1 year old, and I have had plenty of talks about this to my mum over the years. The day came when I was taken away from my mother and father by social services, and this becomes the story of a very unhappy and unhealthy childhood. This is where my story really does get upsetting. I was moved to foster parents in Faversham, where I lived for a very short while. At the same time, Mum and Dad separated as they found out that they were not compatible with each other anymore. My dad stayed in Merston, Sittingbourne, and my mum moved back to Dale & Gardens, Swiss Cottage. After a very short period of time, the new foster parents family I was moved to did not last long. Shortly after moving in with my new foster parents, there was a severe car accident, and my new foster father had been killed in a roadside accident. This is where my life story draws to a temporary blank, as from my files, I'd received the files after I'd written this book, and there were 3 or 4 other foster parents which I stayed with very, very briefly, literally months. And I was in and out of many different foster parents up until I was about one and a half, maybe just under 2 years of age. And at a later date, right, so this is my story down to a temporary blank, like I said before. When my mother at a later date had more ECT, this unfortunately can affect temporary and sometimes permanent memory loss. Previously, during, after this form of barbaric therapy, that's ECT. To this very day, my files have been missing, lost, destroyed. I have put in a complaint against Kent County Council for breaching the Data Protection Act after finding out that they do not have me in their systems, as if I never existed within the system. I have also been in contact with my local MP and also the ICO, the Information Commissioner's Office, since the beginning of 2018. This whole situation has caused me more anxiety, depression and OCD, and brings up the post-traumatic stress disorder too. And this is all getting out of control since dealing with this. OCD means, for some of you who don't know it, obsessive compulsive disorder. And I realise that a lot of kids in the care system can be affected by these side effects of traumatic childhood. I am sure, and I know, I do also suffer from PTSD, which I said before, and this is post-traumatic stress disorder. I also realised that I did have, when I was younger, a separation anxiety disorder too, due to being moved away from one children's home to another, from one foster parent to another. And this is all sort of due to me being in the care system. I got to the point in trying to write down everything I could remember, then everything my mother could remember or had told me in the past. I cannot ask my father, as he had a stroke 4.5 years ago and cannot talk, walk, and is paralysed on one side, on the right hand side of his body, so he is bedbound. But he can nod yes or no, so I am limited in what I can get from my father. So my files are, this is now page 4. Missing. Mum cannot remember around the time she had ECT. My dad cannot talk because he cannot speak after having a stroke. Social services has lost my files. I am at the point of having a nervous breakdown myself. Also, as I have not explained what my files are the history book of my care plan and a diary of my childhood, including notes taken down by social workers in my 6 monthly reviews, which every child has in the care system. I also got out all of my photos from my childhood to help with remembering my childhood, but I cannot remember as there are so many blank memories before I was the age of 8 years of age. My next plan of attack is to go to my GP and get my medical files out. Could I believe it? They were ready for me to collect within 10 days, and this gave me the addresses of all the places I lived at and when I visited my local doctors. But unfortunately, if I had moved and not gone to the doctors, then they did not have my new address, as I moved between foster parents without the doctors realising it. Going back to my childhood and getting my information from my medical files, I had moved to Prince Charles Avenue, Minster, Kent, but I did not stay there that long at all with the foster parents. It was only a few months. The next event, I had scalded my life and my arm. It was the 30th of the 1st, 73, when I was not even 1 year old, when I was rushed to Medway Hospital, when I was scalded by coffee to my right arm and forearm. I was kept in hospital under observation until I was ready with the heel burns and discharged on the 4th of March. This all happened while I was staying at Oak Road, Merston, for a home visit with my parents. In my doctor's files, it says that I was suffering from malnutrition as a body and was very unhappy and unsettled. I had on several times coughs and tonsillitis when I was a baby, and also underweight showing in my records. Apparently, I had been in 8 out of 10 foster homes in just over 1 year, and this would of showed up information in my files, which I have a lot of unanswered questions. Now, since writing this, I have got those files, and that's the reason why I said before that I'd been to 8 to 10 foster parents. There was 2 which I can't really say how long I was there for and if I was just visiting there before moving in. The truth about why this is why apparently I had been put in to 8 out of 10 foster parents in just over a year. Now this is where I was getting a bit confused, because this showed up information in my files which I had a lot of unanswered questions, and the truth why I moved so much, especially when I was so young, and what happened. I do not have any photos of when I was with all these foster parents, so this time is another blank in my life. After all the different foster parents homes I stayed in and moved to a fostering home, which was really then a children's home, but they did not want to label it as a children's home. This home is now closed, so I can name the name. This home was called Alderton House, Hawkstown Road, Walmer, Kent. I moved to Alderton House in and around mid to late 1973 and stayed there through till 1976. At the home, I was the age of possibly 1.5 to 2 years old when I moved there. This is now page 5. This place was like a nursery, children's home. This foster home had around 10 to 12 kids who were all under the age of 6 years old. My mother remembers one of the carers called I can't remember, I nearly said the name, but I can't say the name, who was a young 23-year-old who I was especially fond of. There was a young girl at this home who apparently I was totally unseparatable from. I would scream if she was not allowed to come with me to the beach in Dad's Hillman Imp with my mother and father, because she was my soulmate at the time and I was very, very close to her. She was roughly around the same age as me at the time. At the time, this friend of mine, who Mum cannot remember the name of, was told she could not come out with my mother and father anymore due to her having separation anxiety, which we all had anyway due to all of our circumstances, unfortunately. She later got moved away and I never saw her again, which was so unfortunate. Mum was in a mental institution when I was at Alderton House, somewhere in North London while I was at Alderton House. My mother specifically remembers visiting me with my grandmother for my 4th birthday. All the kids played musical chairs and I got knocked out twice in the first round. And it was my birthday. I was not a happy bunny. We used to also play Pass the Parcel, and the music never stopped when I had the parcel. I think I was a bit of a sore loser when I was a kid when it came to games and didn't win. Or maybe I just never had the luck on my side. I wasn't even bothered about getting the parcel. I just wanted to do the unwrapping. That was more fun because it was the suspense of what the parcel was, rather than wanting to keep the prize afterwards. There was one time when my mother was walking up to the path at Alderton House, and I ran up to greet her and show her that I'd started to receive pocket money. It was not only a 2p piece, but it was a lovely shining 2p piece with a huge smile on my face. This meant I could buy, not only, that was a bad mistake that was, this meant I could buy 4 sweets at this time, which I was ecstatic about. I was happy as Larry, even though I never knew a Larry. After this, Mum started to give me pocket money as she felt so embarrassed that I was happy with such a small amount of money. That this was the first time I had held money and it was all mine. My mum eventually got me a pocket money box, which I used to save to buy a toy from the local toy shop. When my social worker used to visit the staff at Alderton House, she made sure that she avoided me seeing her, as every time I used to see her, I used to scream at the top of my voice. This was due to the separation that every time I saw her in the past, it was connected with me leaving where I was living. And this is where the separation anxiety was really bad. My memory had a bad association with every time I saw her, because I associated her with, this is now page 6, moving again. Well, in May 1976, I did move from Alderton House, and it was a very traumatic day for me. I was on the move yet again. Now this is going to be the end of this video, so that's video 1. Would you like to like it and share it, and I will give you the next update on video 2 for Trapped in the Care System, 18 Years, My Story. Now, sorry if I do stutter a bit, it's just sometimes I'm trying to understand my writing, and sometimes I can't see it clearly enough. But anyway, I'll let you know when the next video is up. It will be up very soon. Have a good day, everyone. Take care. Bye.